In this channel, you will find this video. This is a 1 hour long, full-feature presentation in which I explain exactly how Poise works in Elden Ring. In it, you will find the concepts, the theory, the formulas, everything that you need to know. That video was created during patch 1.09 of Elden Ring, and as you know, we are now in patch 1.10. My dear viewer, it is important to understand that that video is still valid and relevant even in patch 1.10. There are only a few changes, and these changes only apply to PvP. Everything else, especially the concepts, is still completely true and correct. If you want to understand exactly how Poise works, please go watch that video. I will leave a link in the description. That said, in this video that you are currently watching, we are going to go over 3 things that have changed in patch 1.10 when it comes to Poise. In this manner, with both videos, you will have a full and complete understanding of this extremely complicated Elden Ring mechanic. Let's get started. Patch 1.10 was not an exceedingly large patch. In fact, we can consider it to be a rather small one. That said, patch 1.10 is probably one of the most influential patches that Elden Ring has received so far. I say this because we can argue that 1.10 completely changes how the game is played when it comes to PvP. Indeed, the changes to Poise that 1.10 brought to the table were massive. We are going to talk about 3 changes, and it is important that you, my dear viewer, understand that these changes only apply to the PvP part of the game. If you are a player that does not participate in PvP, then these changes will mean nothing to you. They are the following. First, FromSoft increased the poise damage of all weapons, as well as the poise damage of some spells and incantations. This is a serious change because it weakens armor to some degree. Stacking poise is no longer as effective, and we need to look out for new poise thresholds that can maximize our efficiency in PvP. Overall, face tanking a hit has become weaker. Second, FromSoft has increased poise when a player is attacking with weapons, skills, spells, and incantations that generate poise. To make things clear, this means hyper armor. Specifically, attacks that provide the player with hyper armor have become better and yield a higher amount of poise to help trade hits more favorably. Finally, the third change. FromSoft added a damage reduction value to attacks, skills, spells, and incantations that generate poise. Again, this means hyper armor, and overall, this change provides increased defensive value to this mechanic. Players will take less damage when trading hits through hyper armor attacks. These descriptions are enough to have a basic understanding of what we should expect from these changes. That being said, it is important to also understand the details of what they actually do to generate all of this additional value. Let's go over them one by one. As we mentioned before, every single weapon attack in the game, as well as some spells and incantations, have received an increase in their poise damage. Remember that this change only affects the PvP part of the game. Now, this change means that it will be easier to stagger other players with almost every weapon attack, and it will be much harder for players to tank through hits and trade blows with us. So far, so good. That said, these poise damage increases were not done with a pattern in mind. Indeed, every weapon attack received a different boost of poise damage. Some attacks now deal twice as much poise damage. Others deal 50% more, and others deal 40% more. There are many different increase values. Since there is no pattern, there is really not much to understand here. Each attack now deals more poise damage, and the exact amount of poise damage was predetermined by FromSoft when creating this patch. Back in patch 1.09, there was a formula that we could use in order to calculate the exact poise damage of any attack in Elden Ring. All we had to do was plug in the characteristics of the attack, solve, and we would get our answer. Once we knew the formula, it was actually very simple. Unfortunately, this has changed in patch 1.10. For whatever reason, FromSoft decided that a formula was no longer needed and that the poise damage of each attack would be treated separately. Indeed, we can no longer calculate the exact poise damage of an attack. Instead, we have to look up each attack in the game files or different information dumps in order to find its value. So, the question is, how do we go about this? It is in these moments that we have to look to the Elden Ring community and be extremely grateful for the hard work of other Tarnished. In this case, each and every one of you, as well as myself, must be grateful to Cryptid. Cryptid is a Tarnished that has compiled the exact amount of poise damage that each attack deals in a gigantic spreadsheet. With this tool, we can look up whichever attack we need and the information is right there. No need for searches and no need for formulas. I will leave a link to the full spreadsheet in the description of this video. As mentioned before, credit and my eternal gratitude go to Cryptid. The next thing to speak about is the increase to the poise that we get from hyper armor. As we know, some attacks in the game give us hyper armor, and this means that we get additional poise on top of the passive poise that our character has. Elden Ring uses a specific formula that calculates this value, and fortunately, this formula has not been changed in patch 1.10. All of our attacks continue to have the same amount of hyper armor that they had in patch 1.09. So, where is the change? Where is the poise increase happening? Well, the truth is that there is no poise increase, at least not directly. What is actually happening in patch 1.10 is that when our character is in a hyper armor state, they take less poise damage. In order to understand this, we need to learn about a brand new attack parameter that was introduced in patch 1.10. This is the parameter UNK1. This parameter can be understood as an incoming poise damage multiplier, and it is what affects the poise damage that our character receives. This parameter only exists during the hyper armor frames of an attack. This means that when we enter hyper armor, we get UNK1, and when we exit hyper armor, UNK1 goes away. UNK1 only has one single value for every attack that has hyper armor. The value is 0.5. So that means that whenever our character is in hyper armor frames, they receive an incoming poise damage multiplier of 0.5. This 0.5 multiplier makes it so that our character will take half as much poise damage when hit in the middle of its hyper armor frames. To put it frankly, in patch 1.10, hyper armor has an inherent 50% poise damage reduction. That is huge, and it makes hyper armor very powerful. 50% poise damage reduction essentially means that our character's total hyper armor poise gets doubled. Taking into consideration how the hyper armor formula works, having its results doubled is tremendously good, and it will lead to gigantic poise values. Even with the increased poise damage that all weapons in the game get in this patch, we can still hyper armor through most of them. Do not underestimate this change. Hyper armor was already a very good tool, but now it has become an absolute monster. The final change that we need to go over is the added damage reduction value to all attacks that have hyper armor. To put it simply, now in patch 1.10, our characters will take less damage whenever we get hit in the middle of a hyper armor attack. This makes the use of hyper armor less risky, as we will be able to come out on top of more trades. Overall, it is a very good change that makes hyper armor very strong, but the question remains, how do they do this? Well, this change is explained through another brand new attack parameter that was introduced in patch 1.10. In this case, we are talking about the parameter final damage rate. Final damage rate can be understood as an incoming damage multiplier, and it reduces the amount of damage that our character takes while in hyper armor. Again, it is important to understand that this additional damage reduction parameter only applies during hyper armor frames. We get final damage rate when we enter hyper armor, but when hyper armor is over, final damage rate goes away. Now, my dear viewer, you are a smart player, so I am sure that you are already asking how much less damage do we actually take? Well, in order to answer this question, we need to separate every attack into different groups. First, remember that this damage reduction only applies to attacks with hyper armor. So, if an attack does not have hyper armor, it will not have final damage rate, and it will not have this special damage reduction. Next, we need to take every single attack with hyper armor and separate them into 3 different groups. These groups are no final damage rate, meaning they get no damage reduction. Final damage rate of 0.925, meaning that these attacks get a 7.5% damage reduction. And finally, final damage rate of 0.825. This means that these attacks get a 17.5% damage reduction. You can clearly see what attacks are in what group with this chart. Colossal swords and colossal weapons are the only armaments that have the larger 17.5% damage reduction. Alongside them are a group of ashes of war that are, generally speaking, slower and leave the player open to attack. It makes sense that these get the higher damage reduction value. It is important to note that no spells, sorceries, or incantations get this damage reduction value. As for the lower damage reduction of 7.5%, we can see that every other weapon type that has hyper armor but is not a colossal type gets this value. These weapon types are not as slow as colossals, but they still have hyper armor that allows them to trade. Letting them have damage reduction of a lower value makes sense, and it takes into consideration the fact that they are a bit safer than the colossal counterparts. Now, as for spells, almost all sorceries and incantations that provide the player with hyper armor get this 7.5% reduction. Furthermore, almost every Ash of War that is not identified in the larger group of 17.5% reduction gets this lower value. The final group is a handful of attacks that, even though they have hyper armor, get no type of damage reduction. I am not sure if FromSoft made this decision from a balance standpoint or if they simply forgot about these, but the fact remains that our characters will get no additional damage reduction if they are hit during the hyper armor frames of these attacks. Seeing Lion's Claw in this list is wild for me. Normally, Lion's Claw gets all of the mechanical benefits in the game. It is not often that I see it get the short end of the stick. Maybe the fact that it has so much super armor has something to do with it. In any case, additional damage reduction while we are in hyper armor is a very good addition to the mechanic. Combined with the fact that it also gets a 50% poise damage reduction, hyper armor is looking to be very strong. As a fan of the big weapons, I am very happy about these changes. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, do not hesitate to watch the full poise guide that I have linked in the description. You will get all of the information that you need to better understand these changes, as well as a full understanding of how hyper armor works. It is important. Now, as for my final thoughts on these changes, I really like them. They definitely changed the pace of Elden Ring PvP, but I am also very happy with how the new hyper armor works. Being able to trade against bigger attacks while taking less damage is definitely a mechanic that rewards skilled decision making, and also, at the same time, makes the larger and slower weapons a bit more valuable. In all honesty, I don't play much Elden Ring PvP anymore, so I am not sure how the meta is shaping up, but at least I am happy to see that there are attempts to get the big boy weapons in the conversation. In any case, my dear viewer, you now have all of the tools needed to understand Poise in Elden Ring. I hope that it has been useful to you. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that I get to see you on the next one.